Okay, so what is economics, and the 300-year journey that we've been on? Now, essentially the first economist was a Frenchman called Francois Quesnay. He was a doctor, he was a physician, and he was part of a group that ended up being called the Physiocrats in Paris. And he published material and work on what we would call economics now. And in many ways you could call it supply side economics. Certainly that's how it's been categorized in the past. And he obviously was talking about pre-revolutionary France and how a, as it were, supplier, a factory owner, a merchant would behave with the state sitting there, or the king sitting there as the regulator, basically. And he came up with what we would now call the Laffer curve, which is the more the state taxes you in terms of percentage of your income, then the less you're going to work and create income, because it's just going to get taken off you. So to be fair to Francois Quesnay, he was a very insightful economist in terms of the durability of the economic principles that he spoke about. Now, after him, of course, we had the greats like Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, the Scotsman, who's considered to be one of the greats of classical economics, and obviously there's John Baptiste Say and David Hume, and the list goes on. Now, Karl Marx was really a sort of political economist. He really strayed from a lot of economic theory and talking about religion and so on and so forth. It was far more political. So the most you could say is it's political economics, really. And that was very much in the middle of the 19th century when he was in England and in France, and just before the middle of the 19th century. That's when the words socialisme and communisme first started getting used. So you start to see the development of some of those principles that are still very much with us today. And there's obviously a whole range of issues in relation to what Karl Marx had to say in terms of the value of human work, the value or lack thereof of machines, so on and so forth. But in many ways you could call it sort of, I suppose, supply side economics. And the big reforming moment was really actually when John Maynard Keynes came in the early 20th century and started talking about aggregate demand, the consumer, and the government's role in essentially managing the economy in many ways, and how people would behave. So sort of demand side economics. Now, there's still a huge debate that rages between Keynesian economists and more monetarist economists. So that's Milton Friedman and Karl Brunner and a lot of the fellows from the Chicago School of Economics who just talked. Well, the monetarists talked about the stock of money and what it was, and how recessions could be either abated or even avoided if the stock of money was suitably meted out to the market, to the community. And that's in many ways never ended. It's still sort of gone on and on and on. Milton Friedman obviously won the Nobel Prize in the past, but he then was quite successful in the 1960s as well. with his monetarist view of the world. Although he did stress that money is not the only thing, and monetarism was a bit of a sort of simplistic name for him and his people. But certainly, Milton's influence is significant in his argument with Keynes and so on and so forth. Now, in the 80s, you saw Milton Friedman views sort of being continued, but it sort of became the economics of rational expectations. So where you're sort of focusing on the individual having a high degree of rationality, which is fine if that's true, but of course someone like myself would argue very strenuously against that. And happily what we've seen now, and it started in the late 70s with Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky and of course Richard Thaler, is the looking at economics from a psychological point of view and from an individual psychological point of view, and how they make decisions in a way that's certainly not the rational paradigm of the past, but they behave in a way that seems quite counterintuitive, or they behave in two different ways at the same time, which is quite extraordinary, really. So behavioural economics seems to be where economics is going now. Richard Thaler, of course, has just won the Nobel Prize recently. Daniel Kahneman got it back in 2002. Sadly, Amos Tversky wasn't around to pick it up, so that was unfortunate. But their work has really revolutionized economics. If you read Richard Thaler's book, Misbehaving, that really is quite extraordinary. I mean, 5 chapters in, he may not have decided to do this, but he demolishes economics, really, classical economics, or at least 85% of it, by pointing out that rational expectations are ludicrous because they don't agree with observation, which is an important scientific principle. If you have an experiment and your theory doesn't gel with the experimental results and outcomes, then your theory is in trouble. Actually, Richard Feynman, the physicist, says that your theory's dead at that point. Bad luck, however clever you are. So there's no doubt that behavioural economics is very much the way the world is going. It's the way economics is going. It'll have a lot to do with our lives moving forward. And even Rory Sutherland, the great marketer from the UK, he's very much a devotee and a practicer of behavioural economics in his field of marketing to get better results for his clients. And his book, Alchemy, I can certainly recommend. Very, very fine book. Obviously needs to be read in conjunction with things like Misbehaving by Richard Thaler and 0 to 1 Peter Thiel, and Ben Horowitz's book, The Hard Thing About Hard Things. But it just shows how these principles are sort of converging and influencing each other. So in many ways, our 300-year journey started off in Paris with Francois Quesnay talking about supply-side economics, which was very important. But in many ways, the king obviously didn't last much longer in France, only a few decades, and then economics hasn't really progressed until the 20th century with Keynes, Friedman, et al., and then the progression to rational expectations, monetarism almost, and now the work of the behavioural economists. And it is fundamental for how economic policy will be shaped in the future. And I mean, this is obviously quite a short summary, But if you read anything from Francois Quesnay through to the 19th century economists, Smith, Hume, Karl Marx, John Stuart Mills, and then right through to Keynes and Friedman and so on and so forth, it is reasonably straightforward. But perhaps the main takeaway is it does show the amount of time that it takes for human, not so much human endeavour and enterprise, because you can build big projects quite quickly, but in terms of thinking takes a long time to develop, and it takes a lot of comfort on the part of people to change their thinking or modify or progress that. And perhaps that's an example of risk aversion, which of course is an important economic point about human beings and how they behave, very often in a very risk-averse way. Kahneman and co tell us that fear is more powerful than greed by a factor of 2 to 1. That was an interesting experimental result that they came out with, and I think this is key for the future, because money is the convenient form of value transfer that we use just to live our daily lives, basically. And you need to understand economics, and more importantly, governments need to understand economics and what works. And hoping for just big monetarism, money printing, or big government, big state behaviour, as it were, that's not going to cut it. You have to focus on the individual and your observation of how individuals actually do behave, and that's how you get economic policy correct. Which, of course, it's going to be very important from about now in 2020 to 2050, as people want better outcomes for individuals, all individuals, not just the less well off, but also all individuals in terms of being able to buy greener and cleaner goods, from electricity to food to products of all sorts. That'll take an economic shift. And you can't really do that unless all individual consumers have a reasonable amount of money to make those markets work. So in many ways, economics and the proper understanding of it just becomes more and more important.
Great. Thank you.